I'm an MP, or a Teachtadála, Gaelic for MP, in Ireland. Thank you to the panel for your respective contributions, and especially I identify with Mr. Gaspar, because we're a programme country too. The experience of being a programme country really expresses what all of you touched on, and that is that the financial system of the Eurozone and beyond, the financial system of the developed world, has actually trashed the real economies of the world. And we better talk in this realistic language, because we are a family. And I believe in the principles of the early founders, Monnet of the EU, Delors and Kohl, and people like that who really understood the necessity to be courageous and big-spirited in dealing with the problems. And you can't deal with problems unless you measure them and talk about them in everyday language. And that's why, in the case of Mr. Rehn, it was good to hear you talk about unemployment in numbers, because they're real people. They're not statistics. And it's good to see the graphs there by Mr. Gaspar, which showed the various levels of debt in the economy. Household debt and government debt and non-financial business debt, because they're the loans that have to be repaid from the incomes of the elements of the societies where the incomes occur. Households, the people who live in the houses, have to pay the interest and the principal of their loans. Businesses have to make profits to pay back the interest on their loans. And states have to take in revenues from their activities and make expenditures and balance it. Now, in the case of Ireland, which doesn't appear on any of these graphs, your Portuguese position was a 250% household debt and a 100% national or government debt. In Ireland, if you add the non-financial corporate, which is SMEs, household and government, we're at over 440%, the highest in the world. And we've been asked, in a different way to Cyprus, to bear the load of failed private banks. Failed private banks, in the case of one bank, added 31 billion to our national debt. Cyprus deposit write-downs was their way of dealing with the assets that had collapsed in their banking system. So the problem always is, get a fix on the assets. The assets of the banking system. How many banks are there in the Eurozone? What assets are they carrying, and how collectible are they? Because that's the problem. That's the problem that will have to be funded by either mutual bonds, maybe on a perpetual basis, and maybe at a low interest rate, in order to build the foundations for a true, fair society amongst the peoples of Europe. And I'm lucky, from the age of my early teens to the present day, in my early 60s, to have been able to visit countries around Europe, to live with families in Europe, to work being based in families in Europe, new states, the Baltics, in Lithuania, and I've loved that experience. So I'm asking all of you, please don't talk like in the introductory speech. Mr. Barroso was doing his best, but it was in hypothetical language. Language that, like mercury, you can't lift it with a fork. But if you actually measure problems and go to bank balance sheets and find out where the loans were made, because remember this, the banking system created credit and collapsed. This is my final point, but these are thoughts for consideration. My question is, would you please consider these thoughts? In the case of, in the case...
Thank you. Can I just...
Look,
I mean, we have a very short amount of time, and you've taken...
This is the last thought. The reason the financial system broke down was because banks abandoned their fiduciary and trust position of never lending more than 90% of the customers' deposits they take in. They created a pyramid of credit over 7 years. And that collapsed, and the asset prices behind that credit pyramid collapsed, but the loans don't go away, and that's why households are hurting, that's why businesses can't repay it back, and that's why we need to create a mutual fund, a genuine mutual fund, to get a grip on these assets, declare what's collectible and repayable, and fund it, like Consul bonds in the UK after World War I, at a low interest rate in perpetuity. Thank you.
I think we do have an effort coming up to look at the qualities of the assets that are going to go under the control of the single supervisor. But I'd ask Mr. Dijsselbloem to react to those comments, if you would.
Thank you very much. You've given us a lot of food for thought. So the answer to your question is yes, we will take it into consideration. But on a serious note, the first thing that the ECB will have to do when they take on their supervisory task is to have an asset quality review of the main banks that will be under their supervision. And I think very soon after that, of all the other banks in Europe as well, because there is still the risk of contamination between banks. The outcome of that asset quality review, we don't know yet, but it might be worrying. It might be worrying for some banks in some countries, we don't exactly know. What I do know is that when we do have an outcome that is worrying, we need to have the instruments to deal with the problems. Because just exposing problems in banks and not having an answer how to recapitalize banks, how to strengthen them, etc., that will be very dangerous. So that's why I've made the point that we need the instruments ready before the ECB starts with their work. We need the instruments in terms of direct recap, resolution, etc., ready to deal with the problems that will then be put into the spotlight. Whether that will take bonds as the US had after the First World War, let me think about that a little longer. But your main point is we need the instruments to recapitalize banks. We need to do it quickly because it's going to be like a handbrake on our economic recovery. It is in many countries. The lack of credit coming from the banks is now slowing down any recovery of the economy in many countries.